There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a person when they do the math for the first time. Not the math on a tax return, not the math on a mortgage application. A different kind of math, the kind where you add up how many years you've worked, multiply it by what you've earned, and then look at what you actually have, what you own, what you control, what would survive if the salary stopped tomorrow. Most people do this calculation once, late at night, usually by accident, usually because something shifted, a layoff somewhere, a health scare, a conversation that went in an unexpected direction, and the number that comes back is wrong. Not wrong in the sense of an error, wrong in the sense of impossible, because the number is too small. Because the years are too many, because something doesn't add up, and the mind sits with that disconnect in the dark and doesn't know what to do with it. That moment, that specific, quiet, disorienting moment, is what this is about. Not the financial mechanics of it, not the spreadsheet version, the psychological version. The moment a person begins to sense, without being able to fully articulate it, that the arrangement they built their adult life around was never actually designed to take them where they thought they were going. The promise was simple. So simple it was never even spoken out loud, which is part of how it worked. The promise was, show up, perform, and in exchange you will be taken care of. You will have enough. You will be secure. And if you do this long enough, if you do it well, enough. The security will compound into something that looks like freedom. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. Eventually is the word the whole arrangement depends on. So people built their lives around eventually. They deferred. They were patient. They told themselves the discomfort was temporary, the sacrifice was strategic, the ceiling was not permanent. They worked through the years they might have taken risks, through the decades when compounding could have worked in their favor, through the long middle stretch of their working lives when the energy existed, and the time existed, and the possibility existed, and they waited for eventually to arrive. For most people, it doesn't. Not in the form they imagined. Not in the form the promise implied, and the question worth asking, the question that is almost never asked with the seriousness it deserves, is whether that outcome was an accident. Whether the gap between what the salary promised and what it delivered is a failure of the system or a feature of it. To understand what a salary actually is, it's useful to step back from the lived experience of it and look at it structurally, as a mechanism, as an instrument designed by someone for a purpose. A salary is a transfer of fixed, predictable income in exchange for labor, but more precisely, in exchange for the ongoing availability of that labor. You are not paid for what you produced yesterday. You are paid to ensure you will be present and performing tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The continuity of your presence is what the arrangement is fundamentally purchasing. This distinction matters more than it initially appears, because it means the salary is not a reward system. It's a retention system. It's designed to make staying the rational choice, repeatedly, on a rolling basis, indefinitely. Every month the salary arrives, and every month it makes leaving slightly harder, slightly less immediately rational, slightly more costly relative to remaining. The mortgage that the salary makes possible makes leaving more expensive. The lifestyle the salary supports makes interruption more threatening. The retirement account the salary funds makes the long-term departure math more complicated. None of this requires malicious intent to function. The system doesn't need to be designed by someone sitting in a room deciding to trap workers in dependency. It only needs to be designed to solve the employer's problem, which is consistent access to reliable labor at a predictable cost. And a salary, structured the way salaries are structured, solves that problem beautifully. The dependency that emerges in the worker is not a side effect, it is the mechanism. There is something that happens to a person's relationship with money. After roughly 5 to 7 years inside a salary structure, something subtle enough that most people never notice it happening, but consequential enough that it reshapes their entire financial trajectory. They stop thinking about money as something that can be architected and start thinking about it as something that is managed. These are not the same orientation, not even close. Architecting money means understanding it as a material that can be arranged, deployed, positioned, structured, in ways that generate increasing returns over time. Managing money means allocating what arrives so that obligations are met, and some remainder is preserved. One is building, the other is maintenance. And the salary structure trains for maintenance. Because within a salary structure, the income is fixed. The variability is on the expense side. The financial intelligence that gets developed, the financial conversations that happen, the books that get read, and the habits that get formed, nearly all of it is oriented toward managing the fixed income more efficiently, spend less, save more, optimize the allocation. These are real skills with real value, but they are maintenance skills. They operate within a ceiling that they do not question and cannot raise. The person who earns $60,000 and saves $12,000 has not escaped the architecture of their financial situation. They have just maintained it slightly better than the person who saves nothing. The ceiling is in the same place. The structure is unchanged. The fundamental relationship between their labor and their financial trajectory is identical. They are better managed, not more free. And year after year, in the financial media, in the personal finance books, in the retirement planning conversations, the advice almost universally operates inside this framework. Optimize the management, max the contribution, reduce the spending, all of it useful, none of it addressing the structure itself, none of it questioning whether the architecture of trading time for fixed income was, from the beginning, an arrangement, designed to be managed rather than escaped. Here's the part that most people feel before they can name it. Somewhere in the middle years, usually between the late 30s and the mid-40s, a particular emotional experience begins to occur, with increasing frequency. It doesn't have a widely used name, but it's recognizable. It's the feeling of moving and not advancing, of increasing effort producing increasingly marginal returns, of being more experienced, more competent, more knowledgeable than you've ever been, and yet feeling further from real financial autonomy than the younger version of you imagined you'd be at this stage. The raises came, the titles changed, the responsibilities grew. By every conventional metric of career success, progress has been made. And yet the sense of financial vulnerability, the awareness of how quickly things would collapse if the salary stopped, how thin the actual margin is, how dependent the entire life structure is on that single monthly transfer, that awareness has not diminished. If anything, it has grown, because now there's more to lose, more that the salary is responsible for sustaining, more that stops if it stops. This feeling is not a sign of personal failure. It's information. It's the mind registering below the level of conscious articulation that something about the fundamental arrangement doesn't behave the way it was supposed to, that the trajectory promised doesn't match the trajectory experienced, that eventually keeps retreating into a further future with every year that passes. Most people, when this feeling arrives, attribute it to themselves. Not enough saved. Not smart enough with money. Should have made different choices. The system disappears and the individual remains, holding a debt to themselves that the system created and then declined to collect. Let's look at what freedom actually requires. Not philosophically, but structurally. What does a life look like from which genuine financial freedom has emerged? Not comfort. Not security in the precarious sense of a salary that continues. Real freedom, meaning the absence of the compulsion to continue performing in exchange for money. That freedom, without exception, has one structural characteristic. The income is not tied to the continuous presence of the person earning it. It flows from things owned rather than things done, from assets that generate returns whether the owner is working or not, from equity in businesses, from property, from capital deployed in ways that compound without requiring proportional additional labor. This is not a secret. It is the plainest financial fact in existence, repeated in every serious wealth-building text written in the last century. It is known. It is widely discussed. It is the conceptual content of 1,000 books and 100,000 videos, and yet the overwhelming majority of people who know it intellectually do not achieve it practically. The question is why? And the answer is not ignorance, because the knowledge is available. The answer is not ambition, because most employed people are deeply ambitious. The answer is something more structural, more psychological, more architectural than either of those. The answer is that building that kind of freedom requires a tolerance for financial uncertainty, an ability to function, to maintain commitment, to keep moving through periods when income is unpredictable, when the investment hasn't returned. Yet, when the business hasn't found its footing, when the asset is a liability before it becomes productive. And that tolerance is precisely what the salary structure dismantles. Month by month, year by year, the predictable income arrival trains the nervous system out of its capacity to tolerate the uncertainty that real wealth building requires. The salary doesn't just fail to build freedom, it actively constructs the psychological conditions that make freedom hardest to reach. The anthropologist David Graeber spent years studying what he called the violence of bureaucracy, the way large institutions produce helplessness not through explicit oppression, but through the relentless requirement of compliance with processes that feel meaningless. Workers who comply long enough, he observed, often arrive at a state where they cannot locate the part of themselves capable of acting outside the compliance framework. The capacity for independent initiative atrophies not because it's forbidden, but because it's never required. Employment in the modern era operates on a similar principle. Not in every dimension. There are jobs that require genuine creativity, genuine initiative, genuine autonomous judgment. But in the financial dimension, almost universally, employment requires compliance. Accept the offered compensation. Work within the provided structure. Submit to the performance evaluation framework that someone else designed. Receive the raise that someone else decided was appropriate. For years, for decades. And here is what decades of financial compliance produces in a person: the internal conviction that their financial circumstances are largely determined by external forces, that raises happen when the company decides, that income is what employers offer, that financial improvement means performing better within the existing structure, not redesigning the structure itself, that the variable in the financial equation is effort within the system, not the system itself. This is not an obvious belief. It doesn't feel like submission. It feels like realism. It feels like understanding how the world actually works, as opposed to the naive fantasy of people who think they can just opt out and succeed on their own. It is the worldview that salary dependency produces in people of intelligence and experience. The worldview that naturalizes the dependency so completely that questioning it starts to feel like a category error. And the worldview, once established, does what worldviews do. It selects for evidence that confirms it. Every story of business failure becomes proof that the salary was wise. Every period of market volatility confirms that investment is gambling. Every person who left a stable job and struggled becomes a cautionary tale. The world obligingly supplies these examples in abundance, and the salary-conditioned mind, tuned to find them, finds them everywhere. There's a particular conversation that happens between people in their 40s and their children in their 20s, and it follows a pattern. So consistent it might as well be scripted. The 20-something is considering something uncertain, a business idea, a creative pursuit, a move away from the stable path, and the 40-something, from a place of genuine love and genuine concern, explains the risks. The market is unstable. Jobs aren't guaranteed, but they're better than nothing. Build the foundation first. Be practical. There will be time later. The advice is not wrong in its facts. The love is real. The concern is genuine. But what's being transmitted in that conversation isn't just practical wisdom. What's being transmitted is a psychology, a set of beliefs about what's possible and what's realistic, and what kind of person takes what kind of risk that was formed inside a specific experience of employment and shaped by whatever disappointments and adjustments that experience required. The 40-something is not giving advice from freedom. They are giving advice from the place where they arrived after years of not achieving freedom. They are transmitting, with the full authority of experience, a map of the territory drawn by someone who got lost in it. And the 20-something, who loves and respects them, receives it as wisdom. This is one of the mechanisms through which the financial psychology of employment reproduces itself across generations, not through explicit instruction, through the transmission of emotional truth, the felt sense, communicated by someone who lived it, that the uncertain path is more dangerous than the stable one, that the salary, for all its limitations, is safer than the alternative. That eventually will come if you're patient enough, careful enough, good enough at managing what you have. The 20-something who believes this begins making choices. The choices shape the decade shapes the psychology, and 20 years later they have a conversation with their own child. Here's a question worth sitting with. At what point does a system become responsible for the outcomes it reliably produces? If a structure consistently, predictably, across populations and generations and economic contexts, produces a specific outcome, in this case, the outcome of people who work hard for decades and arrive at retirement with far less financial autonomy than they expected, at what point does that outcome stop being the result of individual choices and start being the result of structural design? This question makes people uncomfortable because the cultural story of financial outcomes in modern economies is deeply individualistic. Success is the product of your choices, your discipline, your intelligence, your initiative. Failure, or falling short of freedom, is equally personal. The system is neutral. The system provides the opportunity. What you do with it is yours. But systems are not neutral. They were designed. They were designed by people with interests. And the interests of the people who designed the employment system were, understandably and predictably, the interests of those who needed reliable, affordable, continuous labor. The system they designed is extraordinarily good at producing reliable, affordable, continuous labor. It is correspondingly poor at producing financially free workers, not because anyone explicitly chose that outcome, but because financial freedom in workers is not a design requirement. It was never what the system was built to deliver. Understanding this doesn't produce a revolution. It doesn't even necessarily produce a different set of immediate choices, but it produces something that matters more than either of those things in the long run. It produces an accurate diagnosis. And accurate diagnosis, in medicine and in life, is the prerequisite for anything that might actually help. There is a concept in behavioral psychology called the endowment effect, the tendency for people to value things more simply because they already possess them. When you own something, your mind inflates its worth. The prospect of losing it feels more painful than the prospect of gaining something equivalent feels pleasurable. What's yours becomes precious in a way that distorts evaluation. The salary creates its own version of this effect. The income, the stability, the identity attached to the job title. These are possessed things, owned in the psychological sense, and the endowment effect amplifies their felt value far beyond their actual market value. The salary of $60,000 feels like more than $60,000 to the person who holds it, because losing it feels catastrophic, and things that feel catastrophic to lose are things the mind treats as enormously valuable. This is why salary negotiation is often so emotionally difficult, but leaving employment altogether feels, to many people, close to existential. They are not overreacting irrationally. They are responding to the genuine amplified value that the endowment effect has assigned to what they hold. The job is not just income, it is safety, identity, social legitimacy, the known world, and the mind, wired by evolution to protect what it holds, treats the prospect of its loss with a ferocity that has nothing to do with the rational economic calculation and everything to do with the much older architecture of survival. The employer understands this, at least intuitively. The salary doesn't just need to be enough to keep the employee from leaving, it needs to be just enough that leaving feels irrational. And because the endowment effect inflates the value of what's held, just enough is a lower number than the employer might otherwise need to offer. The psychological architecture of possession does part of the work for free. There's a timeline buried in the mathematics of compounding that most people never properly confront until it's too late to change it. Not too late in the absolute sense. There is almost always something that can be changed, but too late in the sense that the most powerful years of compounding, the early decades when time is working at maximum leverage, have passed. Compounding works through time. The earlier capital is deployed, the more aggressively it multiplies, not linearly, but exponentially. A dollar invested at 25 does not work twice as hard as a dollar invested at 50. It works many times harder, because the returns on the early returns have decades to generate their own returns. The math is unambiguous. The advantage of beginning early is not incremental, it is architectural. The salary structure addresses this mathematical reality in almost the worst possible way. In the early decades, when the compounding advantage is greatest, most employed people have the least disposable income, entry-level salaries, student debt, early family formation costs. The years when time works hardest are the years when capital is scarcest. By the time the salary has grown enough to deploy meaningful capital, the decades of maximum compounding leverage have already passed. This isn't bad luck. It is the predictable output of a system that pays people the least precisely when the value of capital is highest. Young workers are cheap because they're inexperienced, but they're also the people for whom capital deployed would be worth the most. The system captures their best compounding years at the lowest cost to itself, and then, when their labor is worth more, compensates them more. But by that point, the window for maximum compounding has narrowed. The retirement savings that arrive in the 50s are not equivalent to the investment that could have happened in the 20s. Not even close. But the salary structure makes investing in the 20s difficult, and the culture that surrounds the salary structure tells people this is normal, which means most people accept it without realizing they have been handed the least advantageous possible position in the mathematics of wealth building. What would it look like if someone had deliberately designed a system to produce financially dependent workers while maintaining the convincing appearance of a path to freedom? It would start early, in schools, where children would be taught the vocabulary of employment and almost nothing about the vocabulary of ownership. Where career planning would mean choosing which industry to work in, not whether to work for others at all. Where financial literacy, if taught at all, would mean budgeting and saving rather than building and owning. It would socially reward the employee who advances within the hierarchy and treat the person who leaves to build something, independently as a romantic risk-taker, admirable perhaps, but not quite serious. Not the model. Not the path for sensible people with responsibilities. It would structure compensation so that the most golden periods of an employee's tenure, the years of highest salary, most comprehensive benefits, most accrued leave, are the years when they also have the most to lose and the least psychological capacity to walk away. It would frame the primary alternative to employment, entrepreneurship, as something exceptional, something for a specific type of person, a high-risk category reserved for the boldly unusual, not a normal option available to anyone willing to develop the required skills. It would create a retirement system that makes the idea of eventual freedom real enough to be motivating but distant enough to require continuous employment to reach. structured so that the freedom is always deferred, always conditional on continued service, always contingent on the system's continued willingness to provide what was promised. You don't have to believe any of this was consciously engineered to notice that it describes the world as it exists. There is a moment, and perhaps you've already had it, or perhaps it's coming, when the structure of the arrangement becomes briefly visible in a way it usually isn't. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's a layoff notice that clarifies, in an afternoon, that the loyalty was only ever contractual. Sometimes it's a performance review where you realize the metrics you're being evaluated by have no relationship to the value you actually create. Sometimes it's a calculation done late at night that produces a number too small for the years that went into it. Whatever form it takes, the moment has the quality of a particular kind of clarity, the kind that can't be undone. Once the structure is visible, it stays visible. The same commute, the same meetings, the same paycheck cycle, but with a layer of the story stripped away, and underneath it, something more mechanical and less personal than the story suggested. This clarity is not comfortable. It's not supposed to be. Clarity about a situation you're still inside and cannot immediately change is one of the more psychologically difficult conditions a person can inhabit. It produces a kind of cognitive dissonance, the behavior continuing, the obligations continuing, the monthly cycle continuing, while the understanding has shifted and the old story no longer fully functions as sedative. Some people respond to this clarity by closing it off, finding reasons it's wrong, returning to the comfortable interpretation, declining the discomfort in favor of the familiar narrative. This is understandable. The familiar narrative was working, in the sense that it made the situation livable. Discomfort without immediate corrective action available is a specific kind of pain that the mind is highly motivated to eliminate. Others stay with the clarity. They sit with the discomfort. They let the understanding develop without demanding that it immediately produce a solution. And this is harder and slower and less relieving in the short term. But it is the only cognitive position from which genuine change ever originates. The salary was never meant to make you free, not because someone decided you shouldn't be free, but because freedom was never the design requirement. The design requirement was productivity, continuity, reliable output at a manageable cost. The system that emerged from those requirements is extraordinarily good at what it was built to do. It produces workers, capable, motivated, often genuinely fulfilled workers who contribute real value to real enterprises and receive real compensation for doing so. Nothing about this is false. The work matters. The contribution is real. The compensation is earned. But the freedom, the financial autonomy, the capacity to stop without consequence, the life that doesn't depend on a monthly transfer from an institution you don't control, that was never in the design. It was in the story told about the design. The story that patience and hard work and smart saving inside the employment structure would eventually produce freedom. The story that eventually is real and coming and worth waiting for. For most people who believed it, eventually arrived looking different than promised, smaller, more conditional, more dependent on continued service than the story suggested freedom was supposed to be, and the moment that gap becomes visible, the moment the story and the reality stop overlapping convincingly, is not a moment of despair, even though it can feel that way. It is a moment of orientation, of finally standing in the accurate landscape rather than the imagined one, of being, for possibly the first time, in a position to ask real questions instead of waiting for answers to questions the system already decided in advance. That moment is not the end of anything. It is, if you're willing to stay inside it long enough, something much more significant than that. It is the first moment in which a different kind of thinking becomes possible. Not because the obstacles disappeared, not because the path became clear, but because the mind, finally released from a story that was never fully true, can begin, slowly, imperfectly, with all the friction and uncertainty that real change always carries, to ask what it actually wants to build. And that question, asked honestly, for the first time, without the salary's quiet voice whispering that the answer is already decided, that question is worth more than any raise you were ever offered. Because a raise keeps you inside the architecture. That question begins to change it.